The stone slab on top of Silas Brennan's fire pit weighed 200 pounds and was covered in 6 inches of snow. Below it, flames burned steady while the blizzard of 1858 howled across Montana territory with winds that tore the roofs off cabins and killed every surface fire for 30 miles. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this speak to you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might just save your life someday. Silas Brennan stood beside the opening of his buried heat chamber with frost coating his beard like crystallized wire. The iron poker in his hand glowed faint orange at the tip where he had just adjusted the burning logs below. Wind screamed across the Montana high country with force enough to bend the pine trees horizontal, but the flames in his subterranean pit did not flicker. They burned clean and hot, protected by 2 feet of earth and a granite slab that had become a kind of legend in the 3 years since he had dragged it here. It was the 3rd day of the blizzard. Silas could hear nothing beyond the wind, but he knew what was happening across the scattered trapping camps and homesteads that dotted this section of the Bitterroot Range. Surface fires had died on the first day when the wind reached speeds that no amount of sheltering could defeat. Indoor fireplaces were consuming fuel at desperate rates, and the smoke was backing up through chimneys faster than it could escape, filling cabins with choking haze. People were making terrible choices about whether to freeze or suffocate. Silas's chamber required no such choices. The fire burned 18 inches below ground level in a rectangular pit lined with carefully fitted logs. The stone roof captured the rising heat and radiated it forward through the single opening where Silas stood. Even now, with the temperature somewhere far below zero and wind that could strip skin, he could hold his bare hands 6 inches from the chamber mouth and feel genuine warmth. Not the desperate, flickering heat of a failing fire, but sustained, concentrated thermal energy that the stone had been storing for hours. He added 2 more split logs to the fire bed and watched them catch immediately from the bed of coals beneath. The system required half the wood of a standard fire and produced twice the usable heat. The snow on top of the stone slab had not melted because the heat was not escaping upward. It was being directed exactly where Silas needed it, forward into the space where human beings could benefit from it. 3 winters earlier, Silas Brennan had believed in none of this. He had built fires the way everyone built fires, on the surface, elevated when possible, fed constantly, and accepted that winter meant being cold most of the time. He had believed that was simply the cost of living in the mountains, the price you paid for freedom and fur prices, and the kind of silence could only find 2 days' ride from the nearest settlement. Then Henry Dalton had died 50 yards from their cabin, and everything Silas believed about fire and cold and survival had shattered like creek ice under a boot heel. The path from that moment to this one, standing calm and warm, while the worst blizzard in territorial memory tried to kill everything that breathed, had taken 3 years of obsession, mockery, backbreaking labor, and a willingness to dig down when every instinct said to build up. But 3 winters earlier, Silas Brennan had believed in none of this. Winter 1855 came to the Bitterroot Range with the kind of cold that made trees explode in the night when sap froze and expanded faster than wood could contain it. Silas Brennan and Henry Dalton had been trapping partners for 2 seasons by then, working beaver ponds along the tributaries that fed into the Clark Fork River. They had built their cabin the previous summer using standard methods: notched, logs chinked with moss and mud, a single door facing south, 1 small window covered with oiled rawhide, and a stone fireplace that worked adequately when the wind was not blowing directly down the chimney. Henry was from Pennsylvania, the son of a mill owner who had decided that inheriting a business was less appealing than freezing in the mountains for beaver pelts that were already declining in value. He was competent with traps and rifles, good company during the long snowbound months, and careful about the small decisions that kept men alive in country that forgave nothing. That was why his death made no sense to Silas, even after he understood exactly what had happened. On the morning of January 12th, Henry left the cabin to check their northern trap line. The temperature was perhaps 10 below zero, cold but manageable for a man dressed properly and moving with purpose. Silas stayed at the cabin to split firewood and repair a snowshoe that had cracked the previous day, They had followed this routine dozens of times. Henry would be gone 3 hours, maybe 4 if the traps had been productive. 5 hours passed, then 6. Silas loaded his rifle and followed Henry's tracks north through snow that had drifted waist-deep in places. He found Henry 1.5 miles from the cabin, lying beneath a spruce tree whose lower branch had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. The branch had caught Henry across the shoulders and driven him face first into the snow. It had not killed him immediately. Silas could see where Henry had struggled, where he had managed to get his arms beneath him and tried to push upward against the weight, pinning him down. The branch was perhaps 8 inches in diameter, heavy with ice, angled in a way that gave Henry no leverage. He had frozen to death while trying to free himself, probably within the first hour, certainly within 2. Silas pulled the branch away and carried Henry's body back to the cabin. He buried him. The next day, on a rise overlooking the creek, chipping through frozen ground with a pickaxe for 6 hours to create a grave deep enough that animals would not disturb it. That night, inside their cabin that barely held back the cold despite the fire burning in the hearth, Silas sat awake and thought about distance and temperature and time. Henry had died 50 yards from warmth, maybe less. If the cabin had been warmer, if Henry could have survived longer, if Silas had gone looking sooner. That night, Silas made a decision that would consume him. Silas finished the trapping season alone, working the lines mechanically while his mind circled the same questions about heat and shelter and survival. When spring thaw came in late March, he sold his furs at the trading post in Hell Gate and spent the money in ways that made other trappers shake their heads. He bought a notebook and pencil. He bought time in the settlement's small lending library, reading whatever he could find about masonry, and forge work and root cellar construction. He visited every trapper camp within 3 days' ride, examining how men heated their shelters. Surface fire pits were most common, circles of stone containing flames that wind could extinguish with a single strong gust. Indoor fireplaces varied in quality, but even the best ones lost most of their heat up the chimney while filling living spaces with smoke whenever the wind changed direction. Elevated hearths kept fires off wet ground, but exposed them completely to weather. Every system was a compromise between warmth and fuel consumption, between smoke management and structural fire risk. Every system assumed that fire needed elevation and exposure, that flames required open air and height to function properly. Silas began to suspect these assumptions were wrong. In Hell Gate, he spent 2 days watching the blacksmith work. The forge was a contained space, stone and brick forming walls that reflected heat inward. The smith added coal, sparingly, and achieved temperatures that would melt iron. The efficiency came from enclosure, from trapping and concentrating heat rather than letting it dissipate into open air. Silas asked questions until the smith grew irritated, but he learned what he needed. He examined root cellars, those underground chambers where settlers stored vegetables through winter. Even in the coldest months, the temperature inside a properly built root cellar stayed well above freezing. The earth itself provided insulation. 6 feet down, the ground temperature remained constant, regardless of surface conditions. Frost did not penetrate past 3 feet even during the worst cold snaps. Silas began sketching in his notebook, crude drawings that combined what he had observed. A fire pit dug into the ground rather than built upon it. Walls to contain and reflect heat. Some kind of roof to protect flames from wind and precipitation while still allowing smoke to escape. The drawings looked wrong to his eye, violated everything he had learned about fire management, but the physics seemed sound. He showed his sketches to Owen Fletcher, a trapper who had a reputation for innovative thinking. Owen studied the drawings and pointed out practical problems. How would smoke exit if the pit was enclosed? How would you tend a fire at ground level without lying on your stomach? Where would you find materials to build walls underground? The questions were legitimate, and Silas had no immediate answers. By spring thaw, the trapping community thought Silas Brennan had gone slightly mad with grief over Henry Dalton's death. They were not entirely wrong. But by spring thaw, Silas had an idea that everyone would call insane. Summer 1856 arrived with unusual warmth, and Silas Brennan returned to the mountains with a pickaxe, a shovel, and a determination that bordered on obsession. He selected a site 200 yards from where Henry was buried, on high ground with good drainage and clear sight lines in all directions. The location was not convenient to water, which meant hauling buckets uphill, but Silas was no longer interested in convenience. He began digging on the 1st of June. The ground was hard-packed clay mixed with stones, and progress came in inches rather than feet. He dug a rectangular pit 4 feet wide and 5 feet long, removing earth 1 shovel load at a time. After 3 days, he had excavated down 18 inches. After a week, he reached 2 feet. The sides of the pit were vertical, carefully shaped to provide stable walls for what would come next. Jacob Reeves rode past on the 5th day and stopped to watch Silas working in his hole. Jacob was a trapper who had been in the mountains since the 1830s, old enough to have survived more winters than most men attempted. He sat on his horse and studied the excavation with obvious confusion. "Building a fire pit," Silas said before Jacob could ask. Jacob laughed, a short bark of disbelief. "Fires go up, Brennan. Smoke rises. Heat rises. You are digging in the wrong direction." Silas continued working, lifting another shovel of clay from the pit. Smoke rises into wind and gets scattered. Heat rises into open air and disappears. I am digging where neither of those things can happen. Jacob shook his head and rode away, but he talked, and within a week, other trappers began stopping by to observe the crazy man digging a grave for fire. They offered opinions and mockery in equal measure. Fire needed air circulation. Underground spaces would suffocate flames. The labor was wasted effort that could be spent on useful work like hunting or maintaining trap lines. Silas ignored them and continued excavating. When he reached 2.5 feet of depth, he stopped digging downward and began constructing walls. He had spent 2 weeks selecting logs, rejecting anything with excessive taper or irregular shape. He wanted logs approximately 10 inches in diameter, as straight as possible, cut to exact 5-foot lengths. He stripped the bark from each one using a draw knife, working in the evenings until his hands blistered and then calloused. The logs went up slowly, stacked horizontally, to form 3 walls around the pit while leaving one side open. He notched them minimally, just enough to prevent rolling, and fitted them so tightly that daylight barely penetrated the gaps. Between each log, he packed a mixture of clay and pine resin that he had boiled down from sap. People thought he was building a tomb. They called it Brennan's coffin, Brennan's madness, Brennan's failure waiting to happen. Then Silas did something that made even the mockery fall silent. Silas found the granite slab on a hillside 3 miles north of his excavation site. It was part of an exposed outcropping where ancient geological forces had pushed layered stone toward the surface at an angle that made individual sheets accessible. The slab he selected was approximately 4 feet wide, 5 feet long, and thick enough to support substantial weight without cracking. He estimated it weighed somewhere near 200 pounds. Owen Fletcher was visiting when Silas announced his intention to move the stone. Owen had been watching the construction with skeptical interest, and he understood immediately what Silas intended. "You plan to roof your fire pit with that?" Owen said. It was not a question. "Stone holds heat," Silas explained. "A wood roof would burn or rot, canvas would tear. But stone will absorb heat from the fire below and radiate it outward for hours after the flames die. It will protect the fire from wind and snow while creating thermal mass that continues working long after I stop feeding fuel." Owen studied Silas carefully. "That assumes you can move 200 pounds of rock 3 miles over mountain terrain." Silas spent 4 days building a sled from pine logs, lashed together with rope and reinforced at stress points with leather straps. The sled had no metal components because metal was expensive and difficult to obtain. But the wood construction was sound. He borrowed a mule from Isaac Moreland, promising a portion of his next fur harvest as payment. Moving the stone required techniques Silas invented as problems arose. He used smaller rocks as fulcrums and a long pole as a lever to lift one edge of the slab high enough to slide logs beneath it. Then he levered the opposite edge and added more logs until the stone rested on rollers. He pushed and pried the slab onto the sled, a process that took an entire day and left him exhausted. The journey back took 3 days. The mule could pull the loaded sled on level ground, but struggled on inclines. Silas had to help by pushing from behind, and on steep sections he had to anchor the sled with ropes to prevent it from sliding backward. Twice the sled tipped and dumped the stone, requiring hours to reload. When Silas finally dragged the sled to his construction site, Owen Fletcher was there waiting. Together they used the same leverage techniques to position the stone across the top of the log walls. The slab settled into place with a sound like a door closing, solid and permanent. Owen stood back and examined the completed structure. "They are calling it Brennan's stone coffin for fire," he said quietly. Silas was too tired to care about names. He looked at what he had built, the subterranean chamber with its log walls and granite roof, and knew with absolute certainty that it would work. "Let them call it whatever they want," Silas said. "I know what it will do." September 1856 brought the first cold nights, temperatures dropping below freezing after sunset, and staying there until mid-morning. Silas Brennan prepared his buried chamber for its initial test with the same methodical care he had applied to its construction. He gathered dry kindling from dead pine branches, split seasoned logs into pieces that would fit the fire bed dimensions, and arranged everything within arm's reach of the chamber opening. He knelt before the opening and built the fire carefully, starting with a small pile of shredded bark and pine needles at the center of the earthen floor. The kindling caught immediately when he applied flame from his tinderbox. Small sticks followed, then larger pieces, building heat gradually until he could add split logs without smothering the young flames. The smoke behaved strangely at first. It rose from the fire bed and hit the stone roof, then spread outward in all directions, some of it spilling out the front opening, but much of it curling back down into the chamber. Within minutes, the space was filled with choking haze. Silas pulled back, coughing, and watched his fire struggle for oxygen. He had anticipated this problem in theory, but seeing it occur revealed details his sketches had missed. The fire was consuming oxygen faster than the single opening could supply it, and the smoke had nowhere to go except out, the same opening where fresh air needed to enter. The two flows were fighting each other. Silas let the fire burn down to coals, then rebuilt it differently. This time he stacked the logs toward the back of the chamber, creating space at the front for air to flow in low, while smoke could exit higher up through the same opening. He angled the wood to create channels that would encourage draft. The adjustment worked immediately. Fresh air flowed in along the chamber floor, fed the flames, and the heated smoke rose and flowed out the top portion of the opening in a steady stream. Within an hour, the system stabilized into efficient combustion. The flames burned clean with minimal smoke. Heat rose from the fire bed and struck the underside of the stone slab, which began absorbing thermal energy with the patience of geological time. Silas sat 3 feet from the opening and felt concentrated warmth radiating outward, far more intense than any surface fire he had ever built. He fed the fire steadily for 4 hours, then let it burn down to coals. The flames died to glowing embers, but the heat continued. The stone slab had become a massive battery of thermal energy, radiating warmth that Silas could feel from 6 feet away. He placed his hand on the stone's exterior surface and pulled it back immediately. The granite was almost too hot to touch. As evening fell and the temperature dropped toward 20 degrees, Silas sat in front of his buried chamber without shivering for the first time in any mountain autumn he could remember. But working in autumn weather meant nothing. Winter would be the real test. Winter 1856 arrived in early November, with snow that fell for 3 consecutive days and temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there. Silas Brennan faced his first true test of the buried heat chamber with a winter's supply of split wood stacked under canvas and a confidence born from 2 months of autumn experimentation. He had refined his fire management technique, learning exactly how much fuel produced optimal heat without waste, discovering that the stone slab required 4 hours of steady burning to reach full thermal capacity, but then radiated warmth for 8 hours afterward. The first serious cold snap came in late November. Temperature plunged to 15 below zero, and wind howled down from the northern peaks with force that made standing upright difficult. Silas built his evening fire as usual, fed it until the stone was hot enough to make the air above it shimmer, then let it burn down to coals before sleeping. He woke 6 hours later in darkness to add more wood, a routine that required less than 5 minutes of exposure to cold air. The stone was still warm to the touch. Other trappers in the scattered camps throughout the Bitterroot Range were enduring very different conditions. Surface fire pits were useless in sustained wind, flames extinguished as fast as men could relight them. Indoor fireplaces consumed enormous quantities of wood, and even then, the heat vanished up chimneys while cold air infiltrated through gaps in log walls. Men woke every 2 hours to feed fires or risk freezing before morning. Frostbite was common. Exhaustion from constant fire tending was universal. Silas used approximately half the firewood he had consumed in previous winters and stayed warmer than he had thought possible. The buried chamber's efficiency came from multiple factors working together. The earth surrounding the pit provided insulation that no above-ground structure could match. The stone roof captured heat that would otherwise escape upward. The single opening concentrated warmth directionally instead of radiating it uselessly in all directions. The protected firebed allowed complete combustion with minimal fuel. In January, a 3-day storm buried the mountains under 4 feet of new snow. Silas remained in his camp, leaving the shelter of his chamber only to retrieve firewood from his cupboard stacked 20 feet away. The wind never threatened his fire because the flames burned 2 feet below the surface where wind could not reach them. Snow accumulated on the stone slab to a depth of 8 inches, and Silas realized the snow was actually helping, adding another layer of insulation that kept heat from escaping upward. Isaac Moreland visited 2 days after the storm cleared, riding through snow that reached his horse's chest in drifted areas. Isaac looked exhausted, his face showing the distinctive marks of mild frostbite on both cheeks. He studied Silas's buried chamber without speaking for several minutes. "How much wood did you burn during the storm?" Isaac finally asked. Silas calculated mentally. "Perhaps 30 pieces. Maybe less." Isaac shook his head slowly. "I burned more than that each day. My cabin was never truly warm. January 1858 began with weather patterns that old trappers recognized as dangerous. The wind came from the northwest in sustained blows that lasted hours instead of gusting and fading. Snow fell lightly but continuously for 2 weeks, never heavy enough to seem threatening, but accumulating to depths that made travel difficult. The temperature dropped gradually, 5 degrees colder each day, until thermometers at the Hellgate trading post registered 20 below zero and were still falling. On January 23rd, the true blizzard arrived. Wind speeds increased throughout the morning until standing upright required leaning into the gale at an angle that would look ridiculous in calm conditions. Snow that had been falling gently began moving horizontally, driven by wind that turned individual flakes into stinging projectiles. Visibility dropped to arm's length, then to nothing. The temperature continued falling past 30 below, past 40 below, into ranges where exposed skin froze in minutes and breath crystallized into ice before it could dissipate. Silas Brennan's buried chamber burned steady through, conditions that killed every exposed flame within 30 miles. He tended his fire every 6 hours, adding wood in a routine so practiced he could perform it by touch in complete darkness. The stone slab accumulated snow that built up to 8 inches, then 10 inches, then a foot. The weight meant nothing to granite that had survived geological epochs. Below the stone, flames consumed seasoned pine and radiated heat that the buried earth captured and held. Jacob Reeves was not so fortunate. His cabin stood on a ridge 3 miles east of Silas's location, and his primary heat source was a surface fire pit sheltered by a 3-sided windbreak built from stacked stones. The windbreak had worked adequately in normal winter conditions, but the blizzard wind came from shifting directions with force that rendered any fixed barrier useless. Jacob's fire died on the first day despite his best efforts to shelter and maintain it. He retreated to his cabin and tried to keep an indoor fire burning in his stone fireplace. But the wind created downdrafts that filled the cabin with smoke faster than ventilation could clear it. By the second day, Jacob faced an impossible choice between suffocating from smoke or freezing without fire. He chose a middle path, allowing small fires that produced minimal heat and maximum misery. His family, a wife and 2 children, huddled under every blanket they owned and waited for the storm to break. Owen Fletcher's situation was different, but equally desperate. He had built a proper chimney for his cabin fireplace, and under normal conditions, it drew smoke efficiently. But blizzard winds created pressure differentials that reversed the draft, forcing smoke back down the chimney and into the living space. Owen's family spent the second day coughing and crying, eyes streaming from smoke that no amount of chimney adjustment could cure. Isaac Moreland survived comfortably. After watching Silas's system work through the previous winter, Isaac had built his own modified version of the buried chamber. His design was not identical, the pit was shallower, and he had used multiple smaller stones instead of one massive slab, but the principles were sound. On the third day of the blizzard, Silas Brennan heard pounding on the log wall beside his chamber opening. He had not heard anyone approach through the wind, which meant whoever had arrived was desperate enough to travel in conditions that made sound impossible. He pulled back the canvas flap he had rigged across part of the opening to retain heat while still allowing smoke to escape, and Jacob Reeves fell forward into the protected space, frost covering every exposed surface of his clothing. Jacob could barely speak through chattering teeth. His words came in fragments between gasps. His family was freezing. His fire was dead. His cabin was uninhabitable from accumulated smoke damage. He had left them huddled together under blankets and made the 3-mile journey through the blizzard because staying meant watching his children freeze. Silas made the decision without hesitation. He banked his fire to a sustainable level that would keep coals alive, then followed Jacob back into the storm. The journey took 2 hours to cover 3 miles. Visibility was 0. Navigation required following landmarks by memory and instinct, touching trees and rocks to verify position. Wind speeds made walking a battle against forces trying to push them off their feet. They reached Jacob's cabin and found his wife Sarah holding both children against her chest, all 3 wrapped in blankets that were no longer providing adequate warmth. Silas helped them prepare for travel, wrapping the children in additional layers until they could barely move. The return journey took even longer because the children had to be carried. When they finally reached Silas's chamber, Sarah wept at the sensation of genuine heat. The stone slab was still radiating warmth from the morning's fire, and when Silas rebuilt the flames, the chamber became an oasis of warmth that felt impossible given the conditions raging 15 feet away. The family sat crowded around the opening, thawing slowly, while Silas managed the fire and melted snow for drinking water. The blizzard continued for 6 more days. Silas's chamber became a refuge for more than just Jacob's family. Owen Fletcher arrived on day 5 with his wife and infant son, having abandoned his smoke-filled cabin. Isaac Moreland brought his elderly father who had been visiting when the storm hit and whose age made cold exposure especially dangerous. The group took turns sitting close to the chamber opening, rotating positions so everyone received warmth in cycles. Silas taught them the principles while they waited for the storm to break. Dig below the frost line. Build walls that reflect heat forward. Use stone for thermal mass. Protect the fire from wind by putting it where wind cannot reach. The engineering was simple once you abandoned the assumption that fire needed height and exposure. Owen Fletcher took notes in a small journal he carried, sketching designs for a buried chamber he would build when the weather cleared. Jacob Reeves asked detailed questions about stone selection and pit dimensions. Even Isaac, who already had a working system, learned refinements from watching Silas manage his fire. Spring 1858 arrived late, snow persisting into April and melt coming slowly to the high country. When the ground finally thawed enough to permit digging, 7 families in the Bitterroot Range began constructing buried heat chambers using variations of Silas Brennan's design. Jacob Reeves built his with help from Owen Fletcher, Excavating a pit 5 feet deep and roofing it with 2 granite slabs, they quarried together from the same outcropping where Silas had found his stone. Owen's version incorporated a small secondary opening at the rear for improved draft, an innovation that Silas examined and approved. The technique spread through the informal network of trappers, traders, and settlers who moved through the northern Rockies. Men who had survived the blizzard told stories about Brennan's buried chamber to men who had not been there, and those men carried the knowledge west into Idaho Territory and south into Wyoming. By 1860, the design was common enough that newcomers arriving in Montana found existing chambers and recognized them as standard cold-weather infrastructure rather than oddities. Silas never sought credit or payment for sharing his engineering. When trappers asked him detailed questions about construction, he answered thoroughly and demonstrated techniques on site when possible. When settlers heading west stopped at his camp and inquired about the strange stone-roofed pit, he explained the physics of thermal mass and earth insulation with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge only had value when distributed freely. The name evolved organically. What had started as mockery, Brennan's stone coffin, transformed into simple description. Trappers referred to buried chambers as Brennan pits or Brennan systems. Settlers building their own versions called them Brennan-style chambers to distinguish them from surface fire pits. The term spread far enough that by the mid-1860s, men building similar structures in regions where Silas had never traveled were still using his name without knowing who he had been. Silas continued trapping until 1863, when declining beaver populations and his own aging body convinced him the mountain life had run its course. He sold his accumulated furs, his traps, and his remaining equipment. He packed what little he wanted to keep and rode west to Oregon Territory, where land was available and the climate was less likely to kill him. He established a small farm in the Willamette Valley, married a widow named Catherine who had lost her husband to typhoid, and raised her 2 children alongside the 3 they had together. He died in 1883 at the age of 61, his heart simply stopping one morning while he was repairing a fence. His obituary in the Oregon City newspaper mentioned his farm, his family, his service as a volunteer firefighter, and his reputation as a reliable neighbor. There was no mention of Montana, no reference to buried chambers or the blizzard of 1858 or the innovation that had saved lives across 3 territories. But in the mountains, the legacy persisted in physical form. Abandoned Brennan chambers remained functional decades after their builders had left or died. Trappers traveling through remote areas discovered stone-roofed pits and recognized them immediately, using them for shelter and warmth before moving on. Some chambers were maintained continuously, passing from one occupant to another as the frontier gradually transformed into settlement. Modern historians estimate the technique saved several dozen lives.